Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me in this very interesting speaker series. This is a project that has kept me busy for a generation now, and I will try to pull it together in an interesting fashion to bring it also up to date. I have been involved with other people in a generation, what I call a generational project on urban political ecology. And we have recently turned our attention to climate change. When we started this project, we were more concerned with the legacies of industrial society, pollution, and but also questions on water and air and generally the life in cities, life in an urbanizing planet. But climate change, of course, 35 years ago, 30 years ago, was not as much on everybody's mind as it is today. But we cannot avoid it. But to capture this development over this generation since the end of the 20th century into the 21st century, I've chosen to show you these two images of a famous movie, or I should say two famous films, both by the same title, called The Blade Runner. And you have an image of the original Blade Runner from the 1980s, I think in 1983, on the left, and the Blade Runner 2049, which came out in, I think, 2017, a sequel to the original film. And I'm assuming that at least some of you have seen one or both of these movies. And I'm just going to quickly, extrapolate from the significance of these movies for the imaginary that fuels urban political ecology, which is the topic I want to talk about. So the original Blade Runner, it takes place in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles is a city which is dark. It has an atmosphere characterized by acid rain. It is a corporate environment, and the world has now established extraplanetary colonies on which robots work. And the story is about how these robots claim the Earth back by coming back from these exoplanetary territories, from these colonies. And but the story here is that, and the end, particularly for those of you who haven't seen it, I'm not telling any secrets, but at the end of the film, a solution is offered, which is that Los Angeles can be left. This terrible environment can be escaped, and one sees another environment which exists outside of the city, which is a rural environment, an untouched environment, a wild environment, which is non-urban. And the idea at the time in the 1980s is that this so-called Blade Runner scenario would be the scenario for urban life, but there could still be a life outside that would be different. So an alternative was still provided. In the remake of the film of now almost 10 years ago, a different future is ahead. And that future is one that has an image of the full destruction of the world's natural environments. Los Angeles, once again, is the place where this takes place, where the movie is supposed to take place. But now there is no outside to that city. Even the outside of Los Angeles is entirely wrapped up in the urbanizing processes of destruction. Artificial environments, agriculture is under extreme pressure, and there is really no outside left. So the entire planet has now become a problem, which is, of course, exactly the scenario that by all accounts that we find ourselves in 2025. The idea that we are on a limited planetary environment, which is now completely urbanized. And in this environment, we now have to find ways to live. So that's the scenario from which I start. In my personal and of course, let me also admit that these scenarios are very much Western scenarios. These are Hollywood movies, and they are a particular idea about the Western city or the cities of the global North. Um, in my own experience, and I've done research in many parts of the world, but in my own experience, I was in some ways I came to a personal experience 5 years ago when I was on sabbatical in Australia. Uh, at that time, in the winter of 2019, in the fall of 2019, Australia experienced the worst bushfires in its history. Basically, the entire country was on fire. And I, at the time, worked with my colleague Paul McGinn at the University in Perth of Western Australia on this problem about how we can conceptualize the idea of climate change from an urban point of view. And we wrote this small piece, How Suburbs Can Help Cities Against Climate Change. And the idea was a provocation to say, the suburban environment in the Western Anglo sphere, the United States, in Canada, in Australia, and places like that, may be a culprit in climate change, given its automobile dependency. But we will have to think about, from those places where now the majority of people in those countries live, we have to think about how to deal with climate change from those places. And so we made that intervention. And later I traveled through Australia and I stood on the bridge that you see pictured in the middle in that image. And I took that picture. This is a picture I took. And 2 weeks later, this entire town, as you can see on the left picture, burned down. So I had all of a sudden a personal experience that linked me to that intellectual problem of how to deal with climate change from an urban point of view. Of course, this was, as I didn't know at the time, only the beginning of a long and enduring state of polycrisis, not only in my life, but in the world. And I don't want to dwell too much on all the many things that trouble the urban world these days. But in the top picture, obviously, there's a reference to COVID-19, coronavirus pandemic that started, for all that we know, in January 2020, so now more than 5 years ago, and kept us busy. And there is, of course, a story here that is linked to urban political ecology, but I will keep that story on the side burner. Today, I want to focus on other things. But the idea of a global political ecology that has to do with global urbanization, of course, also came into relief during the COVID crisis. The picture at the bottom is a picture from Toronto, where I live in Canada, which is a city on one of the Great Lakes. And we had two major floods with damages of $1 billion in the summer of 2024. And those floods also, brought home in the true sense of the word, this idea that we're now in a world of inescapable climate change. The cities in which we live cannot have an outside in which climate change or the consequences of climate change is other people's problem. It's something that happens elsewhere. It's now everywhere, and by design, show you pictures both from two continents, Australia and from North America, and these are just tiny biographical connections, but I'm sure that each one of you can make similar kinds of connections to their own lives. As part of that project that brought me to the lecture series, the CIFAR project on humanity's urban future, I'm doing a sub-project with colleagues in Canada and the United States and in Switzerland on so-called climate boomtowns, and the topic is future-proofing climate boomtowns, lessons from Geneva, Zurich, Chicago, and Toronto. And we're looking here specifically at the effects of climate change on these rather wealthy banking centers that are in the global north, of which one would assume that they're normally protected from the worst fallout from from climate change. I just wanted to mention that to sort of to give you an idea of what I'm currently working on. We're in the middle of doing interviews for this, so I can't speak much more about it. The core of what I'm going to talk about today is based on a book that came out a couple of years ago, which you see on the left of the screen. It's called Turning Up the Heat, with my colleagues Maria Kaika, Tait Mandler, and Yannis Tzaninis. It's an edited book which brings together emerging scholars and established scholars in urban political ecology. And that is sort of the basis of my comments over the next few minutes. So this book and the project that is behind it, we had workshops and conversations for years that led to this publication. This book was meant to move beyond the apocalyptic scenarios that I started my presentation with, the fires, the floods, and to perhaps think about different kinds of scenarios, which we then, taking up critical voices in urban political ecology, call situated ecologies. And we are particularly interested in this idea of situated ecologies in extended urbanization, an urbanization that cannot be restricted to one city or to the city cores or to individual urban experiences, but we have to see the consequences of climate change. Well, also, of course, the production of climate change itself, the reasons for climate change. We have to see that in relationship to extended processes of urbanization. And I'll talk about that a little bit. I just wanted to also point out that the cover of this book is the drawing of the then 5-year-old son of one of our editors, Yannis Tzaninis' son, Lito, who drew this picture while we were working on the book. And his father asked him, what is this picture about? And he said, this is a picture about fires and climate change. This is a 5-year-old child whose imagination is already polluted in a way by the threats that are going on around him. And he doesn't live in Australia or in Canada with forest fires on the daily agenda, but he lives in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. So we decided to put this picture on the cover of the book in order to demonstrate a particular programmatic, missionary kind of an idea of where the conversation will have to go. It is a conversation about the future, and that is the conversation about the future of our children. The past and the present of urban political ecology, I mentioned that it's we started working sort of as a loose group of people together in the 1990s. In those 30 plus years, we have committed ourselves to a radical heterodoxy of various approaches. And that is perhaps one of the most powerful aspects of this idea of urban political ecology. It's not just one way of looking at the world, but it connects the best traditions in critical and radical thought about both nature and cities. And this book here, which came out in 2006, edited by Kaika, Heinen, and Swingedau, was considered to be the first collection of writings about this idea of an urban political ecology with a whole range of case studies from around the world. And that was sort of the first benchmark of thinking through what this could mean. The original ideas that went into into urban political ecology came from a Marxian understanding of urban metabolism, which was taken up throughout writing on urban political ecology as a methodology of flows. This was also influenced by figures like Donna Haraway and Bruno Latour, who were decidedly either non or post-Marxian in their approach, but clearly infused this thinking about nature and thinking about cities with a post-structural understanding of what would need to be considered, but also figures like Mike Davis and David Harvey, radical urbanists and geographers, were at the forefront of this type of development, influenced this first generation of work. Some of it you can see here, but Matthew Gandhi's Matura Urbana in the center is a recent publication. Gandhi, one of the main founders of this kind of thought, now laid it all out in a major contribution to the conversation, but also references here to a Lefebvrean strand of urban thinking by Henri Lefebvre, by Neil Brenner and Christian Schmid, who changed the way we were looking at cities beyond just the individual city, but into an epistemology of the urban. More recently, also, people have started to make connections across the globe, comparisons. The excellent book by Qian Go on Form and Flow on the left, approaching directly climate change in a post-colonial setting, thinking about Jakarta, Rotterdam, and New York City as sort of a triangle of a colonial past, where the political ecologies of water can be seen in a world historic and world geographic context. These are some of the newest publications in urban political ecology. And so what can we, what can we distill from this kind of work? The first point, which always comes up, and it has to come up critically because it is a contested concept, is that urban metabolism is a dynamic process. Urban metabolism is the idea that things flow into and outside of cities. And here you already have the notion that cities are not by themselves, that they are being provisioned by sources of energy and sources of food, sources of labor that come from far away, and they are recycled and cycled in through the political economies and political ecologies of these cities. And that creates relationships that are potentially, and in most cases now, global. The second point is that urban political ecology creates and talks about new socio-spatial formations. And the city and nature are not separate units, they are intertwined through metabolism. And that also means that you cannot look at the city as just a social phenomenon. It is always a socio-ecological phenomenon. It's also one in which the city is always also natural. It's social, it's built, but it's also always natural. And that has to do with the intertwining of materials, that in cities we fuse material processes that, again, we can theorize as metabolic processes. And importantly, that these urban natures are created through human labor and non-human processes simultaneously. And that is sort of one of the pillars of the Marxian, Marxist legacy in urban political ecology, to think through production and through labor, and to not assume that the water in the city or the air in the city are in place due to natural processes. They're always mediated through capitalist accumulation, through labor processes, through technologies that are part of the capitalist process. So the idea is that while there is a Marxist base, a material base to this, as I've just explained, urban political ecology has also found itself influenced by more heterodox ideas coming from feminist or queer traditions. So the early Marxist anti-capitalist foundation of urban political ecology has recently been strengthened by different kinds of radical perspectives that have, for example, instead of just saying capitalist accumulation, people are now talking about racial capitalism at the basis of global urbanization processes. So when we talk about the production of nature and the urbanization of nature on a planetary scale, we're not talking about that also in the context of racial capitalism, a capitalism that is deeply troubled by its racist structures as it is, and we heard some of that in the previous presentation. Of course, also one in which gender divisions are and oppression of women, for example, are rampant. So that has to be taken into account and has now built into the in the foundation of this way of thinking about the world. So here are some of the examples of books that have been more or less called sort of the symbolic, the signs of the existence of a more or less coherent model of thought that we could call urban political ecology, that deal with various processes of the urbanization of nature around the world, in Los Angeles, in Toronto, in Athens, in London, in New York City, and then also increasingly cities of the global south, as is the case here in Eric Swingdale's book on flows of power. The focus of this collective work that has been done loosely as a cooperative work, the focus of it has always been on unity, and there has to be one goal, to move the intellectual and political debate about green and gray cities into new and productive territory. So it's an intellectual project, but also as much as it is an intellectual project, there was also always the demand to create new forms of action, new forms of policy, new forms of activism on the basis of urban political ecology. The claim for a situated urban political ecology that moved away from this idea that there's one urban political ecology, one way to look at things, where you have structural power and flow and mobility through metabolisms, and then a critique that leads to systematic change, has been sort of modified and moderated in a way by scholars of the global south. And you see on the right panel here, situated UPE starts from power that is distributed and situated. It's not centralized. And there's a situated critique of this power that is reliant on the experiences in particular places where city-making processes are going on. And you can imagine that this kind of critique coming from the global south, it was mostly developed in African contexts, of course, is a critique of the hegemony of northern thought in urban studies. It's part of the southern turn in urban studies. And rather than thinking about flow and mobility through infrastructure, situated urban political ecologists talk and think more through everyday practices of city making. And instead of thinking about systemic change, revolutionary change, uh, to 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 deal with the situation of climate change and in urbanization. They are thinking about radical incrementalism towards recursive empowerment and systemic change. So you have a bit of a bifurcation, but you also have feedback effects that now situated urban political ecology, the critique of the southern turn is now also influencing the way in which the mainstream urban political ecology project has seen itself and its work. Moving forward from this critique of that, people have published to deal with this critique. Here are two examples by Creighton Connolly and by Maria Kaika and Eric Swingerdow of recent publications that have taken up the critique and taken it forward. And then, of course, it's also in that line that, again, our book has to be mentioned. I want to just go mention those 4 points again, that the critique in the book, or the book takes up the critique of urban political ecology from the Global South, and from the Lefebvrean critique, and focuses on extended urbanization, and to move UPE beyond the urbanization of nature thesis, which originally fueled its work, to commit to situated urban political ecologies, to start from where you are, rather than an ideal type of a city or of a process of urbanization, which in the past was always a northern view on urbanization. But we also significantly have now made a commitment to more than human urban political ecology and relational geographies, non-human, more than human geographies. We're thinking differently about the world. We're now not thinking about the urban environment only through the human eye, but also, of course, now through multi-species perspectives, and also through processes of material metabolisms. And lastly, we have committed to address disjunctions between policy, politics, and academic debate, which a lot of this may just stay in the ivory tower of academia if it is not consciously, deliberately brought into the public realm. And the latter third of the book deals exactly with that topic. Here are some sort of newer generation of political ecologists, Hilary Angelo, Dan Cohen, and David Waxmuth, who have challenged the orthodoxy of UPE in the sense that they've said we have to bring urban political ecology back from cities to the urban, to the original idea of political ecology in an urban world. So if more than half of the world is now urban, hopes for its future must rest on the shoulders of the green, sustainable city is the idea that is sort of bandied about. And they critique this idea that it's not individual cities that will make the urban world better, but it is really, we have to address the entire systemic connectivity of cities in an urban world. And it is interesting, since I'm pointing out, is that if the contemporary city discourse around sustainable cities, resilient cities, and so on is almost an escapist fantasy to some degree. You green certain parts of the city while the majority of the urban world is unaffected by those efforts. It's interesting that this is just an article that I picked up yesterday. Is that a lot of sort of the billionaire fantasies that we see swirling around the world right now, where very rich people are buying islands in the South Pacific to protect themselves from the consequences of climate change, built their own cities, but they are also now have been encouraged and emboldened by the Trump administration to create these so-called freedom cities in certain parts of the United States. This is already happening in other parts of the world where privatized enterprises are building cities that are allegedly creating islands of protection from climate change. This is a particularly dangerous idea, or an extension of the idea that you can build green cities as sort of points of refuge from the global planetary crisis that we find ourselves in. And this is something that I believe we need to watch out for, because it's not only, clearly not working as a means of protection of the population, the world's population, from climate change, because it's just a very, you know, it's a selective form of reaction to it. It also comes with a program of social change that is the opposite of that sort of democratic demand that comes with the green city normally. But I'll leave that aside now. So what we're arguing then is that we're working against methodological cityism. We are not thinking each city for itself, but we are talking about a political ecology of urbanization rather than a political ecology of cities. And that means we're always thinking at the scale of a global metabolic socio-environmental process. That doesn't mean we are not touching down in our view. We have, of course, work everywhere. But we are moving away from this idea that place-bound ecological action will be enough to deal with the systematic issues that have been opened up. So again, Angela, Waxmuth, and Cohn that I cited earlier ask us collectively to expand the frontiers of urban sustainability. And they say, criticizing in particular, measures like symbolized by the High Line here in New York City, sort of an urban island, a park in the middle of the city. They say focusing on dense cities and their affluent areas ignores social movements and the advocacy for quality of life issues such as housing and commuting, which have direct ecological consequences. Targeting specific districts ignores the often negative regional and global impacts of local environmental or greening improvements. Whatever you do here might have consequences elsewhere. This is, of course, one of the issues is tourism that draws people to these green islands. So the thinking has to be about the overall ecologies in that context. So there are four tendencies in critical urban political ecology today: urban, not cityist, UPE, situated urban political ecologies, and situating the urban in a particular critical and radical discourse on planetary urbanization. And we need to keep alive the relationships of urban political ecology and environmental justice. EJ stands for environmental justice. It has to be at the core of what we do. So we take up this challenge and move beyond the split and the historical development that has been preconceived in urban studies of agrarian and formerly feudal outsides of cities, which is today replicated as the agricultural outside, and industrial capitalist socialist societies. On the other side, that we have the city that is the domain of the modern. The city is the domain of capitalism, and also in the past 100 years, of course, of socialist experimentation. But we're moving from those dichotomies to a planetary urban society in which not only, as they say, the majority of us now live in cities, but also that the majority of us, where even if we don't live in cities, are affected by processes of urbanization. So This includes this focus on extended urbanization rather than just on individual cities or individual core cities. Includes a resistance to reducing what goes on outside of cities to dynamics and processes that emanate unidirectionally from cities. A potential tendency of some applications of the planetary urbanization thesis. And moving beyond the city also means taking seriously the dynamics emanating from the non-urban. That when we talk about planetary urbanization in that context, we must not eclipse the other half that is not yet urbanized in the conventional sense of the word. But it is exactly those natures, those environments that are outside of the classical urban realm that continue to be significant and have to be thought into this idea of urban political ecology. We cannot leave them outside and green the cities here and leave the gray sources of our energies and of our labor power and of our natural metabolistic flows outside of view. So that's the idea. I will take you quickly now before I stop through some work that I've been doing, which demonstrates just one way of thinking about this idea of urban political ecology in a real urban environment, and that's about the urban fringe. It's about green belts. It's about the suburbanization of our global cities anywhere. This is a picture from my hometown here in Toronto, where a green belt has been established, and you can see, of course, the green belt here is a piece of dirt, but you can see that the housing has been built directly onto the boundaries of the green belt. So we're thinking beyond that. This is an image of the map of the green belt. The gray zones are the urbanized areas of Toronto, home to about 8 million people. And beyond that is a regional green belt that is protected from urbanization. And it's important to see that as one intervention, a planning intervention that attempts to deal with the challenges of continued urbanization. And this is something that is happens around the world, where people are dealing with urban growth in a variety of ways. The green belts of one way or another is one way. And what we've been saying in our work on these green belts, thinking through a urban political ecology lens, is that the territorial boundary between the green belt and suburbia today divides and mediates a complex set of productions of socio-natures that increasingly fail to resemble the city-country binaries of traditional greenbelts. So today, when we talk about these relationships between the inside and outside of cities through an urban political ecology lens, we accept the fact that these are not hard boundaries between the city and the countryside, but these are negotiated settlements that have to be constantly on our radar screen in terms of the changing metabolisms that are going on between the city and the countryside. They change with technology. They change with the demands that the human and urban world is making on the natural world. So we constantly have to think about how these relationships are being reproduced and produced, and you have very different ideas and imaginaries of what these relationships could be. You have ideas about green landscapes, like on the left, which is an image from the green belt, but just adjacent to those kinds of landscapes, you have adjacently to that, you have the brutalscape of new suburban developments that are built hard onto the boundaries of the green belt. And it's interesting, it will be interesting to see how these contradictions are being developed over time. So what we're talking about in this context is an urban political ecology beyond the city, beyond the classical idea of what makes a city. And we're thinking about novel ecosystems that have never existed before. These are human-made novel ecosystems that come with urbanization, novel assemblages of species with a unique set of ecosystem processes and dynamics. So that's what needs to interest us. On the one hand, you have new forms of urban agriculture, new forms of relationships of agricultural production with consumption practices in these cities and suburbs. And you have new forms of development that you need to think through in the context of this. And you have situated landscapes. You have, this is an interesting development in the west of Canada, in Kelowna, British Columbia, where these neighborhoods are now built right into into previously quote unquote untouched nature. It's important to understand that this is in an environment where we've just seen some of the worst forest fires over the last generation. So it's always a precarious relationship. It's a precarious negotiation of urban space with environmental space that is going on. I've done a bit of work around mining areas where this relationship, historical relationship of urbanization and nature is particularly stark. This is in Brazil, in Minas Gerais, in Nova Lima, where you have the rest landscape, the remnant landscape of mining now being redeveloped into new forms of socio-ecological metabolisms. And you have similar kinds of developments in the Ruhr area in Germany, which used to be, of course, the industrial core of all of Europe, which has now become something quite different in a rehabilitation of these mining and industrial landscapes into green landscapes. Here you see an example of this. So the greening of the Ruhr area of the industrial past is one of those negotiation zones in which we find ourselves. This has been wonderfully described in this book by Hilary Angelo, How Green Became Good. I don't have time to get into this, but it's a high recommendation from me. But also in the Global South, here is an example from Africa, where in Kinshasa, another, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is another mining example. But in and around Kinshasa, there are constant negotiations going on around the development of land. And this has been talked about by one of our fellows from that project that I am part of, that brought me to this lecture series, Philip de Boek, who studied this for the last generation. And also in South Africa, this is an image from Johannesburg. And I'm bringing this up before I close, because much of our attention nowadays has to go through reconciliation. Here you see the reconciliation with the apartheid past of a landscape scarred not just by mining as an industrial process, but also, of course, a country deeply still in the throes of the histories of apartheid. And in my country, in Canada, questions of reconciliation are absolutely central to how we understand how we can move forward in any sense that is informed by urban political ecology, because we cannot fall into the trap that urbanization and urban studies literature has always fallen into, to think of urbanization, particularly in a colonial context, as one that takes place without histories. So reconciliation with indigenous pasts and indigenous presence has to be at the core of what we do. So let me leave it here with this image. These are not fantasy landscapes like I was talking about earlier about the Blade Runner. The real landscapes in which we now live look much like this. It doesn't matter where it is. I would say, probably never having been in Calcutta, that still there will be similarities with landscapes there. I've seen this type of new urban development anywhere in the world. This happens to be in East Germany. It's a battery factory for electric vehicles that is now put in the middle of these formerly agricultural landscapes. So industrialization, agricultural practices urbanization, non-urbanization, deurbanization, all are linked through these metabolic processes. And that gives us a lot to think about for another generation. Thank you very much.